no images. Unfortunately, you'll have to listen.
Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the last, or fortunately last, lecture in this semester series for I Prefer Not To. Although we're preparing the next series, so 4 or 5 more to go. And we're extremely honored to have Laurent Stalder and François Charbonnet here. In a way, some kind of home match, I think. At the same time, I think it could be also quite opposite of a home match. I'm extremely curious how you tackle I Prefer Not To. So very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let me switch it on first. That's it? Can someone hear me? Okay. So I just wanted, before we agree with Laurent, that we would do just a short and brief introduction regarding the technique on how to tackle the issue I prefer not to. And I think Laurent and I agreed that it was a difficult way to actually propose a lecture with 2 intervenants, so people who speak at the same time, and we thought it would be more interesting to actually exchange letters in a very old-fashioned way. And just to make it clear, so it's just a series of letters, there are no images. Unfortunately, you'll have to listen. And each one, as one receives a letter, will be reading the other's letter. That is, I'm going to read Laurent's letter, and Laurent will read mine as an answer. And then we'll keep going on like this. There's not really an end. There is an end, but there could not be really an end as such, right? We think the conversation could go on, so that's, I hope there will be a conversation afterwards also. So just to make clear on how this, we've decided to proceed. And we can start. So I start with Laurent's first letter. Dear François, your idea about preparing our talk by email helps to overcome my initial no to participate to Peter's lecture series. Indeed, while thinking on how to engage with the topic, there seemed to me to be only 2 options. A personal account about one's work, or about situations where one failed or succeeded to say no, or a theoretical account about refusal, denial, as a key issue in human relation. In both situations, the possibility of failure seemed very high to me. Therefore, my doubts about engaging with Peter's question. Of course, in the first case, one could have tried to tell entertaining stories, and are we not more and more entertainers, as nobody has time and leisure to seriously engage with architecture, and even more with architectural history, and to bring the public to laugh in recalling situations about failures and successes of saying no. It is always entertaining to hear about the failures of teachers. We know it all too good from our high school years. But what would we really learn from that? For sure, nothing about saying no. And above all, speaking about myself seems to me inappropriate. I'm not here to make my autobiography. In the second case, probably, it was the sheer difficulty of the task which embarrassed me. Of course, one could just take an intelligent analysis of Bartleby the scrivener and make a resume. But if you have the ambition to write your own story, it takes quite a while. You have to find the right literature, you have to clarify your position, and you have to write an ambitious text, and at the end, nobody understands you, because your text is too elaborated. This said, how shall we proceed? As I discover while writing already in this short account, there are plenty of no's. No as verbal expression, and no in front of the immensity of a topic, a no which hides the fear to fail, a no as the way to deal with doubt in avoiding to engage. Your proposal to slightly switch the topic from no to doubt is one of these fantastic shifts you are a champion in. And I think to illustrate it with Caravaggio's Incredulity of St. Thomas would have been a perfect way to illustrate doubt. We could have done a close analysis, as you suggested, about the gaze of Thomas, about the light, the movement of the bodies, etc. But Peter refused. He's better than us in saying no. As I'm writing this, I also begin to doubt about your proposal. As always, the shifts you suggest open up the situation, stimulate, but is doubt not something else than a refusal, than saying no? I don't know yet if this journey will lead somewhere. Looking forward to hearing from you. Laurent.
Dear friend, let me in the first place thank you for your initial message, which unveils a slightly erratic stand towards a suggested issue. And ironically enough, You seem to literally embody the locution, "I'd prefer not to." As a first statement, whether conscious or unconscious, I find that quite joyful. We could stop right where your emails comes to an end. I share your Protestant point of view regarding the opportunity to speak about oneself. After all, the reasons for refusal are often too intimate to be shared, and it could be deleterious but very contemporary shift towards self-exhibition. Let's not speak about us. Also, as you said, we'd probably face a very complacent public on the matter, and vanity would most certainly become the marker of our singularities. Not very promising. Hence my proposal, as you slightly grasped, to opportunistically deflect an all too assertive reading of Bartleby's leitmotif and to question the nature of doubt. One said that the cultivation of it is, I believe, central to any innovative thinking. But of course, I understand your reaction toward my proposal to debate about the incredulity of St. Thomas, and you are definitely right when you distinguish doubt and refusal. But wouldn't you agree that doubt is often the reason for legitimate refusal? Or else said, isn't doubt one of the secret agents of defiance? Yet our host Peter feels otherwise, and I respect any critical eye. Let us try at least outline a series of stands based on subjective readings of Melville's novel. And as for once, we are not asked to talk about what one has done, which implicitly suggests a justification process, but about what one has refused to do, to say, or to advise. The question literally seems to be about no thing, nothing. But how does one speak about nothingness? Wouldn't a physicist be more appropriate? I mentioned the physicist not to evade our responsibility, but because I don't think that the scientist is really interested in nothingness, but rather in the consequences of such a conceptual intendment. So my question is, should we discourse about refusals or about the consequence of a defiances? It isn't obvious to me yet. Postscriptum. Before we engage in a kind of uncertain but promising dialogue, I would like to share with you this brief essay by Gilles Deleuze. As often with him, Bartleby, or the formula, is a luminous speculation that travels at great speed and for sure will enlighten the object of our correspondence. To be continued. My warmest thoughts to the whole family. François. Dear Laurent, second letter. I have just read Melville's novel and was quite shaken by it. Shall we start debating? Comments on Bartleby often qualify its main character as an epitome of resistance, but I personally have a slight problem with such a reading. Isn't resistance always active or reactive? I, of course, know that common language accepts the idea of a passive resistance, but a will is always what allows it to be triggered. And to me, Bartleby seems to be candidly devoid of any will. Even his leitmotif formula isn't really a no, but a softened version of it that can't just be politeness. It is the attribute of a personality without any asperity, which therefore doesn't cast any shadow as a hint of his flesh. Bartleby indeed writes and works, and up to a certain extent also performs the task he has been hired for. But the temperature of his resolution constantly drops, reaching what thermodynamics would call the absolute zero, the temperature at which nothing, not even the smallest particle, remains at move, 273.16 degrees under zero. He must be one of the coldest and most absolute void literature has ever produced. And in order to make that most obvious, Melville loads the novel with sharply characterized electrons, whose agitation and madness increase in the inverse proportion to the condition of Bartleby's will. The contrast is stunning. But you more certainly know that the absolute zero is actually a projection. It can in fact never be reached. The projection, or prophecy, can therefore never be fully accomplished, which echoes a certain idea of the architectural project and its corollary attributes, namely A1, an impulse, where the kinetic energy is at its highest, the earliest stage of the projectile. A2, in the course of the development, this kinetic energy is transformed into potential energy. A3, a speed as a function of time. B, a trajectory which would be the stand taken in given problematic. C, a moving target. D, deflective actions to adjust with the constantly evolving position of the target. Considered in such a prospect, a project can hardly be stifted by a definitive state. It is by essence dynamic. And Bartleby to become the fixed axis around which the fleeing and futile trajectories of capitalistic lives revolve. I personally see no equivalent to Bartleby, certainly not in the field of architecture. Deleuze, in his essay, qualifies him as the ultimate original. But is he an origin or an end? And what is an origin? Isn't the concept of origin a modern one? Amitié, François.
Dear François, thank you for your projectile reading Bartleby, which is indeed a very convincing one. Also, it leads to death, and therefore to an end, and might therefore be understood as a failed project. But maybe there might be another dimension, a less architectural one, less embedded in an isolated reading of the projectile Bartleby. This reading might have less to do with one subject, but between different ones, or between the object and his milieu. Also, Bartleby does not act, but stays in place, is erratic and contaminates his surrounding. By being erratic in a moving world with different modes, he gets his subjectivity, while the others, considered at first stance more individual, become more and more passive. This short note while waiting for the plane, where the static dynamic relation is at its paroxysm. All my best, Laurent.
Dear friend, I very much agree with your statement on alternative reading, and I believe that the phenomenon you describe can be applied to any meaningful outlandish, to use Melville's formula, or else said, peculiar behavior or idiosyncrasies. And I would even be tempted to propose a scientific flip-side analogy. Couldn't Bartleby behavior be that of a black hole? A supreme attraction force that swallows its surroundings and precipitates behavioral disruptions on the part of the other characters. The only course of action left to the human satellites revolving around him would therefore be a constrained estrangement. Similar to Spinoza's plea of escaping depressive nature because of their devouring energy toward the immediate environment. Bartleby's essence is viral, and the effect of his behavior can only lead to the most improbable astonishment. It is literally unbelievable that it exceeds all comprehensive dimension and triggers as a result a vortex of erratic conducts. But I don't think that Bartleby stands alone in this state. One had to recall Hector Berlioz's reaction to his first hearing of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, leaving the concert hall in a state of frenzy and hysteria. The work had reached beyond what one could decently apprehend, ultimately setting a fixed and irreducible moment in the history of music. To give birth to such singularity is threatening, as the revolutionary French composer suggested. And cultural history is full of such moments, leading to most sinister or most glorious consequences, from Galileo to Stravinsky and his Rite of Spring, through Beethoven and Kafka. The sudden eruption of the unknown and therefore of the inconceivable. In a word, prosperous stance that radically inflect one's way of capturing reality. Amitié, François.
Dear François, I've been thinking on how to read your email. It seems contradictory in its formulation. On the one side, echoing Deleuze's idea of projectile, is it from Le Pli, Leibniz, or Le Baroque? It proposes a positive reading of the I would prefer not to, a radical trajectory towards a goal which can never be reached, which on the other side seem completely at odds with Bartleby's fate, as his refusal brings him to his own end. While I was searching for explanations, I found this video of Giacometti from 1962, which could help us a step further, as Giacometti proposes a reading of his work as a permanent refusal of the convention of artistic and more general visual practice, of secured meaning, but at the same time as the pursuit of a goal to better understand what he sees. Could this be an issue out of the desperation of Bartleby? All my best, Laurent.
Dear Laurent, my digression or deflection of Bartleby's behavior is contradictory for the only reason I believe that Bartleby is a novel character and that his trajectory can only keep either on one side, life, or on the other, death. But this either-or dichotomy only applies to a living subject. What of an inert object or of an idea, as in the case of architecture? None of them has to choose, and in fact they can't, but they can latently remain an everlasting potential with indefinite borders, which take us to Giacometti's statement as he sees his work of art as a constantly evolving and never accomplished one. It is embedded in perpetual movement of approach without being able or even wishing to reach its final state. It is as if Giacometti has raised the status of the repentir, which shows the essential uncertainty of overlaid preliminary drafts, to the final level of representation, refusing to give its work a categorical outline. The doubt not expressed as a state of mind, but as a state of the art. It is an Auseinandersetzung with time, and a wide part of Giacometti's corpus oscillates between static and dynamic figures, each one acquiring characteristics of the other, a vibrating head or a stifted walking silhouette, contradictions in terms. I personally see the architecture project in a similar way. It has to be kept on the move of a fleeing trajectory, and as such, time becomes, of course, one of its most influential parameters. You see, I think one should deny the death of Bartleby, the character, the right to bring the velocity of an idea to an end. I simply think that death is, in this case, a literary feature, and had the novel for any reason gone on, the revolving characters around him might well have used all their respective energies to a final state of nothingness, used and abused by the force of friction that Bartleby's vortex create around them. To be continued. Amitié, François.
Dear François, this short note to thank you much too late for your Deleuzean text. It seems there that here again our two approaches to problems show up in all their clarity. Your systematic way of analyzing a problem and framing its general issues, my empirical one, by collecting examples, like the Neinsager. A conservative person who does not want to change the existing world as it is considered as perfect, the Neinsager of Bertolt Brecht. The story of a boy who is not ready to sacrifice himself for his community, the no of the terrible twos, this age where children begin to make their own choices by opposing by a no every possible thing, remark, decision. This no seems to relate to a constructive of one's own identity. There would be plenty of other examples. The German substantive no-go, an Anglicism from the English adjective no-go. It means an interdiction or taboo. Further, non-stop, no way. Many different ways of saying no. As soon as I have read Bartleby, I will come back to you. All my best. Laurent. Dear François, I just finished Bartleby, the book Peter gave us as a reference for his no lectures. Before engaging with the book and the formula, I would prefer not to. Let us look at other possibilities to say no. The Oxford Dictionary indicates in its blog, where it collects all the historical occurrences of the term, no less than 29 different manners. Here they are. Number 1, no. 2, uh-huh. 3, nix. Nixie, nixie, nixie. Nope, Nah, no way. No way, Jose. Negative. Veto. Out of the question. No siree. For foul nor fair. Not on your life. Not on your Nelly. Not on your tiny teen type. Not for all the teen China. Not in a million years. Under no circumstances. Not likely. Not for Joe. Thumbs down. Pigs might fly. Not a cat in hell's chance. Fat chance. Catch me. No fear. And go fish. Go Fish is an American card game, usually played by children, in which each player in turn asks an opponent for a particular card and is told to go fish from the undealt deck if denied. Undealt deck if denied. The term has taken on broader use as a playful way of saying no. But what is striking with Bartleby is that he uses only one specific way to say it. I would prefer not to, which seemingly engages only him, but as the novel shows, entails his whole environment. But what could that mean for architecture? Are we ready to take this step? Or are things to be clarified? Laurent. Dear François, I don't know whether this helps to clarify our topic, our approach, our hypothesis, but as we are still searching, I would like to propose another perspective on the topic on Melville's book, which I found in a text by literary scholar Leo Marx, author of a wonderful book, The Machine in the Garden, which you might know. The book was very useful for several researchers we did, as Marx, more than others, is able to relate literature to cultural history. This is what he does also in his essay on Bartleby called Melville's Parable of the Walls. Marx does two things. In the first place, he relates the topic to Melville's biography, pointing out that the author was, while writing Bartleby, in a crucial moment in his life. A moment where his writings would shift from his very popular books to his intellectually more demanding prose, letting him fall into a crisis and obliging him to reassess his position towards himself and society. Secondly, and this is perhaps more relevant for architects, he points, as the title of his essay says, why did we not see that earlier, to the importance of the walls in Melville's text. First, of course, the setting in Manhattan, Wall Street, the place of the office of the lawyer where Bartleby works. But it is also a walled street with walled rooms. Bartleby works in a room with three windows looking all three on walls, one black, one white wall, and one white without color. But his window had previously a view. It is in front of this death wall that Bartleby would stand and stare. This wall, which blocks a former view, separates Bartleby's from society, from the Wall Street society. It is this wall which Bartleby will look at when stopping in the writing job he was assigned to do. It is again in front of the wall that Bartleby will die in prison, still staring, as he dies with open eyes. Marx gives the following explanation for the importance of the wall as a parable in the book. Then why has Bartleby allowed the wall to paralyze him? The others in the office are not disturbed by the walls. In spite of the poor light, they are able to do their work. Is it possible that Bartleby's suffering is, to some extent, self-inflicted? That it is symptomatic of the perhaps morbid fear of annihilation manifested in his preoccupation with the dead wall? Melville gives us reason to suspect as much. And Marx ends his essay with a comparison between the author, Melville, and Bartleby, which shows once again the slight difference between what you call projectile and its radical but also deadly interpretation by Bartleby. Quote, among the countless imaginative statements of the artist's problems in modern literature, Bartleby is exceptional in its sympathy and hope for the average man, and in the severity of its treatment of the artist. This is particularly remarkable when we consider the seriousness of the rebuffs Melville had so recently been given by his contemporaries. But nothing, he's saying, may be allowed to relieve the writer of his obligations to mankind. If he forgets humanity, as Bartleby did, his art will die, and so will he. The lawyer, realizing this, at the last moment couples Bartleby's name with that of humanity itself. The fate of the artist is inseparable from that of all men. The eerie story of Bartleby is a compassionate rebuke to the self-absorption of the artist, and so a plea that he devote himself to keeping strong his bonds with the rest of mankind. Today, exactly a century after it was written, Bartleby the scrivener is a counterstatement to the large and ever-growing canon of ordealist interpretations of the situation of the modern writer. I hope this helps us a step further. All my best, Laurent. Dear François, just a short notice. I discovered this week 3 more different aspects of no. It seems that our investigation will cause us some problems, as the more we think about it, the more the field opens up. But this seems to be the general condition of every research work. Here, very briefly, the 3 aspects. A first concerns a balance of interest between work and family. So it is about a choice. One has to refuse one thing to be able to do another. A second interpretation was proposed by Sarah Oppenheimer, the American artist, who instantly responded to my question, how should I interpret no? That for her, no meant slowness, the possibility to advance a work, an idea, a proposal, independently from exterior pressure and conditions, independently also from the modern logic of time, performance, calculable result. A third interpretation popped up while I was preparing a lecture about the accident in architecture. In this lecture, I tried to understand why the internationally acclaimed architecture of post-war Britain failed in almost every case to respond to the exigencies that were put in it. Why the well-tempered space of the History Faculty building in Cambridge, designed by Sterling with a heating and ventilation engineer, failed. Why almost all acclaimed housing projects in Britain became at a time or another a slum. These failures may be brought back to the failure of the modern production logic. The buildings were able to answer the calculable rationality of post-war planning. They did not respond to the performances assigned to them. Strangely, the refusal in this case does not come from a person, but from a thing. Is it possible? Looking forward to having your thought on this. All my best. Laurent.
Dear Laurent, I have the feeling, not the conviction, that failure, as you describe it, slightly pulls that out of our range of analysis. After all, no one really works at failing, and an object, a design, or even an intention always turns out to be a failure, only if time and exterior perception qualify it as such. This extendedly seems to me contradictory with the state of mind of Bartleby. And yet your statement could also be right if one ought to consider that characters and their selective perceptions apply a judgment on Bartleby, and their afflictions toward him most definitely evolve with the time frame of the novel. But who are we to say that Bartleby's standpoint is a failure? It can only be one if we consider the productive canons of our time as the only way to live, with its summoned realization of the self as the only acceptable trajectory. Not that I wish to become a Bartleby, but I can only admire his Marmorean and indisputable stance. Bartleby seems to escape judgment and is hors du droit et du devoir. He simply is. And Melville doesn't justify the crashing orbit of his chain character, and therefore isn't judgmental of the behavior of the strange man. This takes me to the other 2 convincing points you make, namely the notion of choice and the struggle for time, both of which are central not only to the development of architecture, but also to the way we lead our respective lives. The act of choosing always presupposes a corollary, that of renouncement. In other words, choice is always a relic of a defiance, and the variables are always at least 2, even when the second term is nothingness. And when we speak about a choice, the discourse necessarily triggers the awareness of its declined pendant. And here comes the famous anterior conditional that we all have experienced in our life. Shouldn't we, couldn't we, and so on. But no such thing in Bartleby, right? No regrets, no anterior condition, no nothingness. Admirable of bravery and of independence of mind, don't you think? No one nor anything would deflect him from his line of conduct, although everyone in the novel tries. but it would be an all too cosmic ambition, and frankly an unreasonable one, to decently try to outline the question of choice. Too vast a topic, too personal too. So is a question of time, but allow me to try to delineate issues at stake when engaging in such a consideration. I propose that we leave aside the imprint of time onto architecture itself, which is a fascinating topic, but most likely well addressed in scientific literature, and very briefly focus on the embryonic phases of the architecture project, where time, or rather a relation to time, isn't a passive and expectative one, but defines the term of the equation of what is yet to come. As opposed to the coupled time product, in which hardly any interdependent dynamic takes place, time and process are, on the other hand, and as we all know, resultantly entrangled, the one defining to a great extent the attributes of the other. And in an era where the sole horizon seemed to be a short-term profit, no matter what is at stake, transgeneration or not, it becomes sadly obvious that time has turned into a great luxury, not in the sense of an expandable parameter, but really as an extremely rare commodity. I have the greatest respect for those who have the strength to dictate the rhythm, and Gilles Deleuze again expresses it in his abécédaire. On ne bouscule pas un artiste. I don't consider to be an artist, but issues are nevertheless similar. And I would add, on ne bouscule pas une idée. Yes, as Sarah Oppenheimer suggests, the struggle for time is undoubtedly a core issue of projecting. Did you know that the SIA 102 foresees what is labeled as recherche de partie as the first step in the development of a project and grants it's 3% of the overall procedure? And if one considers the following phase, that of the schematic design, the percentage raises to ridiculously modest 9%. It is like asking Tiger Woods to drive with a putting wedge. In other words, today's consideration for one of the most crucial and perilous times in the development of an architecture project has shrunk it to hardly anything more than a glimpses of intuition opportunistic petrified in a categorical product. Some call it pragmatism, or worse, realism, when it really isn't opportunism with a short view. Doubt as a necessary accessory of imagination has been brutally ruled out. We are left with the hard edges of technocratic frameworks and today's fetishes for consumption. Any nuanced resolution mobilizing collective memory and critically hardly stands any chance anymore. Compressed time and short-term profit have turned the project into an authoritative and unequivocal procedure. Amitié, François.
Dear François, thank you very much for your clarifications. Yesterday, another attack happened in Paris. An outlaw driven by a destructive ideology attacked a representative of the state, of the conventional policed order. This makes your first statement about the choice even clearer. Indeed, Bartleby is not ideological. He's not driven by others. He's not even an outlaw. He's just himself. As you say, he has no interior condition. If he is radical, not in the sense that he pursues the roots, the radix of this or that, but only insofar as he goes back to the roots of the human condition. As Deleuze says in the text, you recommended to me, Bartleby or the formula, the expression I would prefer not to is not so much an indication of things and actions, but are acts, speech acts in themselves. Speech acts, as Deleuze says, are self-referential. Therefore, also the difficulty to transpose I prefer not to architecture, literature, etc. As first and foremost, I prefer not to is linked, and here again I agree with you, with a person and not a work. Deleuze again says, it makes Bartleby a pure outsider, an exclu, to whom no social position can be attributed. Bartleby, through his speech, acts, becomes a man without references. This quest reminded me of a difficult contradiction I wanted to resolve while writing on Valerio Olgiati's iconographical autobiography. He states there in relation to two pictures, Robert Ryman's white-stripped Untitled, 1965, and Helmut Federley's gold monochrome, Untitled, 1990. Olgiati writes about the first, and says it represents everything. It represents nothing. And about the second, it represents everything. Obviously, one could exchange the captions as the images are, through their radical interrogation of the state of painting, the it represents nothing, a contribution to the state of painting itself. The it represents everything. By this, another time dimension comes into play. Not only the time of creation, the on ne bouscule pas les artistes, one should indeed add to this sentence, on ne bouscule pas les œuvres d'art. As Bartleby, every artwork tends to the infinite, to the infinite, which we could call the classical. Time makes this judgment. Indeed, the new can become old, or it can become classical. So much for today. All my best, Laurent.
Dear Laurent, I know this might seem a step backwards, but if I may, I would like to share with you the passage of Deleuze's essay, which interests me the most as they are closely linked to the way we could like to think of the architecture project at Made In. I quote, "The confidence man, much as one says the medicine man, is sprinkled with Melville's reflection on the novel. The first of these reflections consists in claiming the rights of a superior irrationalism. Why should the novelist believe he is obligated to explain the behavior of his characters and to supply them with reasons, whereas life for its part never explains anything, and leave in its creatures so many indeterminate, obscure, indiscernible zones that defy any attempt at clarification? It is life that justifies. It has no need of being justified. The English novel, and even more so the French novel, feels the need to rationalize, even if only in the final pages, and psychology is no doubt the last form of rationalism. The Western reader awaits the final word. In this regard, psychoanalysis has received the claims of reason. The founding act of the American novel, like that of the Russian novel, was to take the novel far from the order of reason and to give birth to characters who exist in nothingness, survive only in the void, defy logic and psychology, and keep their mystery until the end. What counts for a great novelist, Melville, Dostoevsky, Kafka, or Musil, is that things remain enigmatic, yet non-arbitrary. In short, a new logic, definitely a logic, but one that grasps the innermost depth of life and death without leading us back to reason. The novelist has the eye of a prophet, not the gaze of a psychologist." End of quote. Amitié, François.
Dear François, there is one issue we tried to escape till now. We did not address history. Also, we argued through our exchange with historical examples. Bartleby is indeed a fiction that is placed in history. Leo Marx situates the work in the life of Melville, stresses out the economic context of the work published in 1853. In the quote you send me, Deleuze also historizes the personage, the character, even if indirectly, in comparing him to other modern figures. Modern Ulysses, as he calls them, without a name, regicide and parricide. He refers to the enigmatic dimension of the novel to Kafka, to Musil, and to Dostoevsky. But what would it mean to conceive of a contemporary Bartleby, and what would the I prefer not to be today? Of course, the context has changed. Probably the resistance would be against the logic of rationalism, liberalism, and administration. But how would that work? And can we still believe in the fiction? Can we still believe that the fiction of the work of art and the artists we discovered throughout our exchanges? Somehow, until now, we have only been asking, what is I would prefer not to? But shouldn't we ask also, which I would prefer not to is appropriate? Or may it even be that the question is not a question anymore? A few possible ways to find an issue. A fiction, also a historical one, is always a tale about life. Therefore, Bartleby is contemporary. The context of Bartleby is a clearly regulated one, not by chance. The wall has a central role in Melville's novel. Obviously, today, the limits are others, less visible ones. In Melville, one can be outside or inside. There is no in-between. How could one deal with the threshold situation? Could it be the flaneur, the drafter? Or is it the dropout, or even the hacker? And finally, where should one situate the work of art? Can it still be so monumental, isolated, Or is it not rather an action, an intervention that transforms an environment? All my best, Laurent.
Dear Laurent, quite a few questions you raised in your last message, but let us try to address some of the issues you mentioned regarding the contextual framework, or else said, history with a capital H. I personally believe that history is not simply a sententious succession of events, either condemned to obsolescence or considered with a moaning and blind allegiances. The "it was better than before" syndrome. An inflection point in history can most definitely, if not in whole, at least partly remain one after it has taken place. So, one way to embrace it would be to consider it as a dynamic and therefore still potentially active, or if not uplifting, then at least informative. Specifically, in the field of architecture, where the notion of progress really is devoid of any meaningful substance, for the very good reason that mankind's most basic and central needs have hardly evolved over time. Who would seriously dare to say that between the Domus in Pompeii and the Villa Stein in Garches, a progress had taken place on an architectural level? If any at all, then on a technological one. But even that is, I think, questionable. I sometimes have a scenery in mind when addressing issues in architecture. I move forward looking backward, or else said, j'avance à reculons. One would today rather hear, don't look backwards, you are not going that way. But I would really prefer, look backwards, you're not going that way. Which literally makes no sense but embraces a contradictory dynamic, yet contradictory only in the terms. Ossip Mandelstam, in Le Bruit du Temps, has an extraordinary way to express a similar ambivalence. I quote, "My memory is not of love, but of hostility, and does not strive at reproducing the past, but at keeping it at distance." End of quote. And to do so, one needs a lot of memory, not a nostalgic one, but a proactive and critical one. In that respect, factual knowledge is only useful insofar as it can be vectorized by an always renewed intention. Or else said, knowledge is not an end, but a beginning, and it should be everything but archiving. You now see very clearly that to me, the contextualization of a given problem is indeed a relevant aspect of the understanding, but hardly ever turns into a scorched statement, which would conclusively narrow the range of its significance in the present. Or else said, a given problem can potentially enter in a resonance with another one, no matter how far apart these are or might well have been. Such a consideration allows me to, I believe, that an hypothetical Bartleby set in today's context would be even more extreme a posture, and that this vortex environment would be even more acutely experienced. In the Feuilles d'Hypnose, René Char suggests that our heritage is devoid of any preconceived will. Notre héritage n'est précédé d'aucun testament. The past, therefore, does not leave any syntactic or grammatical readings of events. So the real question would be, how do we proceed with it? In the second part of your email, you dare to bring our conversation back to where Peter probably would have expected us to begin with, namely how to resist, or under which circumstances does one resist? Well, I don't think I can answer such a question, for the reason for such a behavior are too radically specific and therefore bypass any systematic approach. I could well mention resisting moments or necessities, but it would become impoverishingly anecdotic. Having said that, there is at least one point I am convinced of. The most radical resistance for an architect lies in the project itself, not outside of it, but literally within it. No matter how pressured or biased a decision might be, one is still free. That is, one has the inalienable right to reasonably propose alternative thinking by means of projective measures. It is not to me the only limit or open boundary the architect ought to accept, that of his own horizon. And so it seems to be rather a presumptuous way to engage in a service feature, which is what architecture ultimately and indisputably is, yet there is nothing cavalier about it. The seminal stage of projection is an excess and a profusion and should never be negatively defined and constrained. I quote, a new logic, definitely a logic, but one that grasps the innermost depth of life and death without leading us back to reason, end of quote. But of course, I realize that in today's opportunistic context, such a statement can only be perceived as suicidal or worse, ideological. Yet, I personally think that it is, on the contrary, the most dignified way to express critically. François.
Dear François, we had, I think, both thought that your last email would be the last one on our I prefer not to exchange. But it raised so many questions and disclosed so many possible misunderstandings that I feel the need for some few remarks. I hope you forgive me. I guess we agree on many points about the openness of historical knowledge, the potential of history and its informative dimension, and even sometimes its authoritative character. We agree, I think, also on the notion of progress, which we might link, as you say, to technology, but for sure not to architecture. And finally, we also agree, as I understood, on the fact that the past facts and events are per se no particular value, besides the one we are able to give them. This does not mean, of course, that history is arbitrary. It has to rely on facts, and the argument has to be traceable. But history is neither definitive. There are not only matters of fact, as Bruno Latour rightly stated, but also matters of concern. Therefore, a particular attention must be given to the way we look at history. In this short message, I just want to stress two ways. The first one, which you seem to follow when you state while discussing the Villa at Garches, that there is no difference between the villa and a house in Pompeii. Implicitly, it presupposes the possibility of architectural or even anthropological constants. We live, we work, we die, we have tools, we have shelters, etc. And this ever since. The second one stresses not the constants of architecture, of humankind, of life, etc., the what, but the different ways of dealing with them, the how. It accepts chronology, but not understood as a succession of events, of even a way of progress or an evolution. Rather, it is concerned by different regimes and its way of answering the essential questions you put forward. The remarks which concluded my last exchange were directed to this issue. 1. Melville gives a very particular setting to this novel, different milieus, divided, separated, distinguished by different walls. In this context, trespassing one of these walls, for instance, that given by the professional milieu of the office space is viewed as a violation. 2. Melville proposes a very particular figure, an individual without identity in the anonymity of the metropolis. It seems to me that the architectural setting, the figure and its way of resisting, maybe even the whole cultural context in which the tale unfolds, are very much characterized by the regime of modernity. The separation between private and public, individual and society, law and outlaw, etc. But what would it mean today? You very honestly stated that you could only answer through your individual work. This might be perfectly right for an individual confronted with an individual task to resolve. But to be free is also to understand the conditions in which one works. It seems to me, therefore, that the question should be brought on another level. What does this individual work stand for? What does it represent? Or even what is represented by it? This would be the how. This is for now. See you tomorrow. Best, Laurent.
And today it continued in the train, in the newspaper actually, by the former French Ministry of Justice, Christiane Taubira, nous voterons Macron. She writes, I would prefer not to. C'est une saison pour les humeurs de Bartleby. Moi aussi, je préférais ne pas. Et pourtant, il faudra. Non, il ne faudrait pas. Il faudra. So much for today.
Thank you. Aujourd'hui, c'est aujourd'hui.
Okay, thank you very much. What I do like about the series, and this is a kind of almost unexpected result, let's say, is that due to the title, which is a completely ambivalent title, it's impossible to react to in a way. we still arrive at and achieve, I think, very different formats of talking about something which is maybe not specifically about I prefer not to. So it allows you to open up the floodgates and you said at the beginning that it would be presumptuous and maybe even, I don't know, unethical to stage yourself, but in a way, I think this is the most intimate, and also reading each other's letters, even though they are very tough letters in a way, they're not, well, I think they're very, very intimate letters, and I must also, I mean, probably everybody with me, I would like to reread them in all calmth, so maybe we should put them on the website, because it was quick. But out of this almost rejection of staging yourself or talking almost by yourself, I think you chose, I think, one of the most intimate and most personal and almost most staged formats that are available, which I find really interesting. And I don't think it's problematic. On the contrary, I think it's fantastic. But when did this moment arrive to read each other's letters? Because I think that's it's an act of love in a way, or of war.
No, well, I can only go into your direction. I find it, there was this skepticism at the very beginning and how to tackle these issues, and we both agreed that we didn't speak about ourselves. Of course, you mentioned the fact that a letter is a very intimate way to communicate, and it is right, and it was a very pleasant way, at least on my side, to really exchange. But that's almost the unexpected, or let's say, it was not planned, it was not planified, it was not the goal as such, and it was really, how do you deal with such an ambitious question? And I think the interesting point was in a conversation like this, and even more actually through letters, because through letters, it's like a little bit the story of death. There is always a delay, right, in the answer. It's not a conversation when one reacts immediately. There's been sometimes 2, 3, 4 days between each letter, and sometimes we also have to move certain parts to another because the question seemed more appropriate at that time and so on. But what I mean is that you can change extremely fast the lanes of conduct, the lanes of the topic. And that probably makes the listening kind of difficult because of these changes, these sudden changes. But that's the beauty of it, I think. The whole thing is about opening doors and never closing ones. I think the whole conversation is only about expressing doubts, of course certain statements or certain convictions, but it's always keeping in mind that what we're trying to do was always to open doors and never close ones.
Yes, and I think there is a different level of intimacy. Of course, the format is very intimate, and the struggles you may find in the letters are intimate. But somehow we are always speaking about something, and not about ourselves. It's about a research project or a research question. Somehow we are exchanging, and perhaps what is also intimate is that at a certain point we felt not able somehow to answer your questions, so we needed a precise time frame because we knew we had to be here, so we had to begin 3 months ago and beginning to write, and somehow this way of exchanging allowed us somehow to even be able to produce something. But I think it's what is intimate perhaps is the struggling, but the topics we are addressing are topics which are outside somehow, which are analyzed and are not. It's not a story about our failures, so it's not a story about our struggles, and it's not a story about our ways of saying no. It's about trying to understand the question you raised by putting this.
Knowing part of both of your work, I saw a lot of things coming back that are fascinating you, that are troubling you. So yeah, and at a certain point, I think it was in François' letter, was, I mean, if you would talk about the work, I presume the work of Maiden would be anecdotic. That's not opening doors, I think.
No, but what I meant is that, look,
because
specifically, I think resistance can only be addressed under specific terms. I can hardly believe as resistant as just a systematic occurrence, for example. This is, you cannot speak of French resistance, you cannot speak of cultural resistance unless you speak of specificity of this resistance. There is not the resistance, there are only resistances. And I think that's really the problem. I mean, that's the fascination for the question, but also the danger of it, that you start describing those moments that can only be apprehended in the specificities of a certain context. And by doing so, of course, I'm sure you could do something quite interesting, and you would probably please also the public. But at the or not, but I'm just saying, if the anecdotes are good enough, you might please the public. But I'm just saying, the question has always been, I think, you mentioned that in the letters you feel, our interest, our problems, issues, and questions. Well, that's one of the questions. Huh? Mm-hmm. It's really, how do you resist, or how do you talk about, and I think Laurent mentioned it in one of his letters, the difference between a scientific approach, as he does in history, and a systematic approach, which tries to stress out, let's say, general tendencies of systematic approaches to a certain notion. Mm-hmm. That's what we thought would be interesting to address. Mm-hmm. More than specifically, that's also the problem of the couple, or two. How would we actually deal with refusal of each other and specifically address the context of a given situation to address this issue? It would have been, again, repetitive, iterative, and probably more difficult to. That's why we decided to address the issue on a more systematic level, probably. But it remains personal, I agree. I think I have probably less of a problem with Laurent. It's not about talking about yourself. I think everything is a matter of perception. Of course, you cannot evade what you think or how you think. And by writing or by expressing yourself, we use an encoded language. But this encoded language is always partially expressing what we are. That, I think, is something fascinating about language also. It says languages are only an encoded way of exchanging ideas, but the way each one of us really specifically feel is much deeper. As Nietzsche says, every word is a mask, is also a mask. It says something and something else. That's the whole difficulty, I think, and the beauty.
Questions? Other questions?
It can also be on the format, or just on the way we proceed. It does not to be an intelligent question.
Doubts.
I have a question for Peter. Because when we started the lecture, we had the idea to actually promote this Caravaggio's painting.
Yes.
And I'd like to hear about you. Not that I'm upset or anything. I found it really brave that you said, no, fine, you don't do that. And I find it really great. I have no problem with it. But I would like to hear on how problematic you would have felt if we had switched the topic to, let's say, to the issue of doubt. Because doubting is, I think, implicitly also in Melville's formula. I prefer not to is not a clear no, right? I'm not sure, I'm not saying this is one-to-one a relationship that we can cope and then say.
Does maybe you have to explain.
Yeah, well, what we're proposing, when Peter asked us, we discussed with Laurent, we said perhaps we could try to actually shift the question. I propose,
think.
Yeah.
No, because I think it's important.
Yeah, I propose to shift the question to the question of doubt. And of course, the composition of Caravaggio's painting was essential to it, not just the parable of St. Thomas.
Also, it's St. Thomas looking at the body of Christ.
Well, that's the thing, he's not looking at the
but
body.
But he points his finger into the wound of Christ, just to know
I would
see if Jesus is there or not.
But I want to tell you what we thought about. We thought,
Yeah,
I thought about it. And it's probably going to be the topic of a lecture later on, I hope, someday. If you know the painting, you know that St. Thomas is the only apostle who did not believe Jesus Christ was resurrected, so he needed to put his finger into his flesh to believe it. And in Caravaggio's painting, unlike in other representations of St. Thomas, he indeed puts his finger into the flesh of Christ, but he's not looking at the wound. He looks somewhere else. I had the feeling, perhaps it's abusive, I don't know. I had the feeling we experience a time where clients are all St. Thomas. They need to touch the flesh of the project, but they don't look in the proper direction. They don't look at the miracle. Jesus Christ is the miracle in the painting. They keep constantly looking somewhere else, but they touch it, right? In other words, they need the product to believe in architecture. They do not believe in the process. They only believe in the product. And I think that's a central problem of today's society. That's what I wanted to mention about it.
Well, I can, of course, not give you a closing argument on that because it's also a very personal So when I saw the image, for me, it was closing a lot of doors already. I think that was a kind of, it was, and I think there was also a couple of lines, if I remember correctly, on the issue of doubt. And again, maybe it's very personal, but the reason why we started this series is actually I don't want to know beforehand who will be talking on what kind of approach will, and maybe that was the kind, maybe it's not even about the image as such. Although maybe yes, because at the same time it made me realize, so thank you for that, made me realize that we had the first poster, if you remember, by painting by Luc Tuymans, the architect. And that is very personal, that we're trying to find, because there will be a third poster, the final one, so a kind of series. And I didn't feel it in the series, so, but I can't explain you the, it's, but that's not the most important reason. I think maybe you took me almost by surprise in a way, and I said no.
Very good answer.
But it was not brave.
No.
Let's be honest.
Well, thank you, Peter, for giving us this opportunity.
I think, I mean,
at least
again, I have to reread the, I mean, because it was really quick and a lot of information, and I didn't get everything, I mean, because that's, and even maybe the auditorium is not the best setting, maybe, but I hope it's possible to publish it. And I also hope that it's not stopping here. I think it would be nice, not as a forced thing or even a forced entertainment for the sake of an audience or even for you, but I think if it's something which has initiated something that you couldn't predict, then I think
You see, it has,
won.
and somehow there are many issues we didn't resolve and talk about, especially the contemporary condition, which interests me very much because the setting is so well given by Melville. It's this scrivener which is in this room, and his view is closed, and he's separated from the main protagonist by a folding curtain wall, a curtain. And then he dies in a prison. So there is a very 19th century way of dividing the sphere, and which finds its expression in architecture. So there is this level also in this novel, which I think is very fascinating. This is the first level we try to discuss, and the question would be, yes, okay, but what would be the setting for such a guy today? Where could one imagine such a person today, and how would he resist somehow in a society where the distinction between outside and an inside are not so clear anymore? So this is the first setting. And the second setting, which I think is interesting, is that he's a complete modern figure. He's Exclu, which, in my opinion, is very much a 19th century and early 20th century figure. And as I tried to say, following Deleuze, is that in Musil you have the Mann ohne Eigenschaften, which is somehow a similar, or James Joyce also. There are some similar figures in the modern literature. So who could we somehow imagine to be this person today, and from this then somehow perhaps better understand or to systematize somehow our own stand. That's somehow where we disagree, where François said, okay, I can just say where I resist and how I resist in a certain project, and my stance would be, but how could be a kind of resistance in the 20th century or the 21st century context? This would be the first one, and somehow what would be the setting for such architectural setting for such? So there are two ways. So one way is the way of the Bartleby as designer somehow, and the second way would be what kind of frame of architecture would we give to this kind of novel.
But look, I think we tried, at least not extensively, but at least we tried to approach an answer to that, and I agree with your 2 points, but I think when I said that the only way for us to resist as a practitioner is within the project, it's not by yelling out what we think, it's not by being part. Of course we resist as citizens also, but this is only through the project that we can resist, I think. Now, it seems absolutely banal and it goes by itself. That's what you do, that's how you resist, and it is everything but obvious. I feel today we are in a time where it is really the time to say that, again, the project can resist, because this is the only and indisputable independence that we have. This is the radical independence of the architect. No matter what kind of constraint might well be legitimate, financial constraint, legal constraint, even expectations, fervors of a time, and so on, you still have, once all this is being, expressed, and so on, you still have the right to promote a projective resistance through the project. And not by saying, look, or doing something that would, let's say, please someone. You can always resist, but we forget about this because we accept, the framework that is given to us as a solid one and not a flexible one and not trivial one. I think this is essential. We are not simply actors and reactors. We also are able to think beyond what is given to us. This is not possible to treat architecture and to absorb architecture or to even start thinking about architecture saying that it's been negatively defined from outside. You have to define it from the inside, and this freedom we have. There are several ways to do it. As a practitioner, I do it through the project. What Peter did by leaving the practice and then trying to be a practitioner also in another field on the political level is of extreme bravery, but it's something else again, I think. You resist differently. You kind of resist on the frameworks, and I kind of resist within the framework. But it's not, I think it has to be said to all the students. I think this is essential that you do not start to please someone or to cope with the fervor of the time. You are here to start thinking about what could be done. And that's why you have to, I think, hochschießen, much higher than what is expected to you, much higher. This is a matter of exigency towards society. It's a responsibility. It's not simply that you do because you're pleased to do. You have to do it, I think.
Yeah, well, I had a question about the idea of time and the format again, and what you were saying comes back to that, how to, let's say, how to do instead of not to do, how to make practice active. And if I understood correctly, in the first letters, you were still skeptical about saying yes to Peter and to participate. And then in the end, by doing, instead of not doing, of preferring not to, you have done. And you're here, and we are all here. So my question was about time. And at some point, on the discussion, the idea of saying no is a strategy to conquer time, a much needed time, a luxury in our days. But the fact of doing it brought you eventually some time to write the lectures that you wouldn't have if you wouldn't say yes. If you would have said no, you didn't have wrote the letters. So the fact, so where are we regarding time?
I think what you actually did was you said, I prefer not to, and then you redirected it, which I think is the essence of the whole thing. You didn't say no, you didn't say yes, and in that sense also the text which is on the poster is not a correct text. But it's no, but right. It's there for a certain reason and a certain kind of to initiate certain even resistance. But you said actually in a very beautiful way and in a very layered way, and I prefer not to. I think
kind of
for very different reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
Both of you for very different.
Yep. I think we did, right?
Yeah, I think we struggled because we had the impression one would expect something from us, and we had to liberate us from this expectation. We had to liberate ourselves from a definitive stance,
and
somehow through this process we have chosen to get the independence we needed to reflect on the subject, and perhaps also to put away the pressure of having a definitive answer to this kind of question. Yes, this is for sure. Yes.
Having said that, I have to say that this is one of the very beautiful topics that we have been given to us to speak in a lecture, even though it was difficult or anything. I think just, you know, this small moment, the Melville novel and this formula is brilliant, because you can see, as you mentioned at the very beginning, at the end of the lecture, that there can only be several answers to it and never one. Right?
They prefer not to, I think.
Thank you very much. I mean, I really enjoyed it. And again, I will even enjoy it more after rereading the text. We finish here for the semester. I think it's been a brilliant finale. Food for thought. And like I said, we're trying to put together a third semester. But you will see the poster hanging somewhere soon. Thank you very much.